Everybody, Maverick Christian here. In this episode, I'm going to talk about rational incoherency and certain objections against theism and theistic arguments. Part 1. Rational coherency. In philosophy, the term coherency can mean different things in different contexts, but one definition from one of my college introductory philosophy textbooks says that rational coherence is a criterion that considers how well parts of a philosophy hang together. The elements of a philosophy may not be explicitly contradictory, but they can still fail to fit together very well. Some atheists make the mistake of having a rational incoherency in their belief system when critiquing theism or theistic arguments. I'll give some examples in this episode. Part 2. You're absolutely certain that God doesn't exist? In January 2020, Apostate Prophet debated inspiring philosophy and capturing Christianity's channel. In this debate, God was defined this way.
By God, I mean a necessary immaterial mind that created the universe.
With that in mind, how sure is Apostate Prophet that there is no God?
If you had to assign exact numerical probability to the existence of God in light of what you know, what would that probability be?
How do we do that? Like on a scale or on a percentage?
That's what I said.
What do we do?
Yeah, you could try to do like a percentage. You could also do it in like your credence level. Like I'm 60% sure
At
of
the
this.
moment, I would say there is 0% chance for God.
For those whose arithmetic is rusty, that means he's 100% certain that God doesn't exist, which is quite remarkable. I'm confident that God exists. I think the evidence is significantly in his favor, but I don't think the evidence is so ridiculously overwhelming that I'm certain about it. What kind of evidence so convinced Apostate Prophet that he's absolutely certain that a necessarily existent creator doesn't exist?
So this is somewhat related. Maverick Christian asks, what evidence, if any, and this is to you, AP, what evidence, if any, justifies absolute certainty that there is no necessarily existent creator of the universe?
I would say that, as I pointed out at the very beginning of my opening statement, that there is no absolute evidence that there is no God or no creator, and that there is no absolute evidence that there is a creator. That there is no evidence for a creator and there is no evidence against a creator. There can never be evidence for it.
Apostate Prophet's belief system might have an explicit contradiction in it, but there seems to be a problem of rational coherency, because if he doesn't have any real evidence for his belief that the creator doesn't exist, his absolute certainty doesn't seem to be rationally justified. If you have no evidence for or against this creator, why not be agnostic and say, I don't know whether this creator exists? Wouldn't that be a more reasonable position? Part 3. The moral argument. The moral argument is the family of arguments that use morality as evidence for theism. Here's one version. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective morality doesn't exist. Premise 2. Objective morality does exist. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. A problem of rational coherency occurs when an atheist rejects both premises. Why is that a problem? For starters, consider my justification for premise 1. That justification is, given that God does not exist, it is likely that objective morality does not exist, which entails that the first premise of the argument is probably true due to a theorem of mathematics and propositional logic I've mentioned in earlier episodes, with a proof of the theorem being available on my blog. How does one judge whether, given that God does not exist, it is likely that objective morality does not exist? Analytically, it looks like this. See whether God does not exist plus background knowledge equals objective morality not existing. So in my case, I put on my atheist hat and I asked myself, if I were an atheist trying to rationally assess whether objective morality existed, would I believe that objective morality probably doesn't exist? Indeed, I would. Given God's non-existence, it seems very likely to me that objective morality does not exist for reasons I've explained elsewhere. But in the case of the atheist, atheists already believe God doesn't exist, so given God's non-existence kind of becomes given what I already believe. So atheists just have to ask themselves whether they believe it's likely that objective morality doesn't exist. And if an atheist does, the power of logic compels that atheist to accept the first premise as at least probably true, because they accept the justification for the first premise. What this means is that an atheist can't rationally deny both premises, because if an atheist believes the second premise is false, logic dictates such an atheist should accept the first premise, since they accept the justification, and the justification entails that the first premise is probably true due to that one theorem of mathematics and propositional logic. And yet I've seen a number of times where atheists reject both premises when it's not logical to do so. Part of the reason for this is that most atheists and people in general aren't trained in logic, even though I think logic should be part of standard K-12 education. If they were trained in formal logic, it'd be easy to explain why in standard propositional logic, both premises being false leads to contradiction. For more on that, you can see my Introductory Logic series, where in part 2 I provided the proof that in standard propositional logic, both premises of the moral argument being false leads to a contradiction. Part 4. The argument from evil. Very understandable reason to believe that God doesn't exist is the evil we see in the world. Now, I don't pretend to know all the morally sufficient reasons for why God would allow evil, and while this doesn't prove that there are no such reasons, the inability to imagine such reasons certainly plays a role in some people's feelings on the matter. One thing to remember, though, is that the existence of evil requires some sort of moral standard. As C.S. Lewis wrote in Mere Christianity, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? Man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" From an intellectual standpoint, the existence of evil doesn't bother my belief in theism as much as it used to, because I believe that if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. Why does that matter? Well, for atheists who don't believe in objective moral standard but think the existence of evil argues against God's existence, there's a serious rational coherency problem. To illustrate, suppose a hypothetical theist concedes that there are evils in the world but believes it is morally good for us humans to try to fight against them, refraining from doing morally wrong actions, advancing medical technology, learning to share our food with the hungry, and so forth, with the limited abilities we have, with the obstacles we face, etc., and that this is better than God making the evils any less bad, and such that if God shared this standard of moral goodness, God would allow all the evil that exists in this world, because on this standard of moral goodness, God would have morally sufficient reasons for doing so. Namely, it is good for humanity to fight against these evils with the limited abilities, etc. An atheist who rejects moral objectivism might reject this theist standard of moral goodness and say that if God shared the atheist standard of goodness, God would not allow all the evil that exists in this world. So on one standard of moral goodness, God would not allow all the evil in the world. But on another standard of moral goodness, God would allow all the evil in the world. Without an objective moral standard, there is no objective fact of the matter about which standard of moral goodness God would adopt if he existed. So there'd be no objective fact of the matter whether God would allow evil if he existed, in which case the argument from evil would thus collapse under its own weight. It couldn't even get off the ground. So the atheist who doesn't believe in objective morality isn't in a rationally coherent position to use the argument from evil. This is also why the problem of evil doesn't intellectually bother me as much as it used to, because the first premise of this moral argument seems true to me. Namely, that if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. The first premise, if accepted as true, basically prevents the argument from evil from getting off the ground, since the argument from evil won't work without objective morality. Part 5. Conclusion. Quoting again from one of my first philosophy textbooks, rational coherence is a criterion that considers how well parts of philosophy hang together. The elements of a philosophy may not be explicitly contradictory, but they can still fail to fit together very well. Some examples of the deficiencies in rational coherency I gave were being absolutely certain that God does not exist while also believing there is no evidence against his existence, believing both premises of the moral argument to be false, believing evil is evidence against God's existence while also not believing in objective morality. For the second example here, it's worth noting that in standard propositional logic, both premises of the moral argument being false leads to a contradiction, with the details explained in my introductory logic series. I've said it before, I'll say it again, logic should really be part of standard K-12 education. If it were, problems of rational coherency might be less common. This is Maverick Christian, and I invite you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.